Do you know what happened to ancient humans when they fell asleep in the dark? Start with your own body. Think about what happens the moment you drift off. Your breathing slows, your heart rate drops, your eyelids become heavy and seal shut, cutting off your primary sense of the world. Then, a chemical signal washes through your brain, inducing a state of temporary muscle paralysis. You lose the ability to run, to fight, or even to stand up. For 8 hours, you are entirely disconnected from your environment. Today, we call this rest. 2 million years ago, in the tall grasses of the Pleistocene epoch, it was called volunteering to be eaten. Every time an early human closed their eyes, they were making a terrible gamble. The world they lived in did not pause just because they were tired. In fact, the exact opposite was true. As human vision failed in the fading twilight, the ancient world woke up. If you want to understand the physical reality of what the night meant for our ancestors, you do not need to imagine it. You only need to look at a piece of bone held in the archives of South Africa. It is a fossilized hominid skull found in the Swartkrans cave system, known to researchers as SK54. It belonged to a child, an early ancestor of ours who lived over 1 million years ago. But what makes this skull haunting is not its age. It is the damage left behind on the bone. At the back of the skull, perfectly spaced, are 2 deep puncture marks. They match the lower canine teeth of an ancient leopard. This cracked skull tells a very specific, terrifying story. The child was not killed in a fair fight. The bite marks suggest the predator clamped its jaws directly over the child's head, likely crushing the skull instantly before dragging the body away to feed in the darkness. This was the reality of the ancient night. Leopards, saber-toothed cats, and giant hyenas did not respect human life. They saw sleeping bodies as easy calories waiting to be harvested. For early humans, the act of falling asleep meant surrendering all defensive capability to an environment packed with apex predators. They did not have heavy wooden doors with steel locks. They did not have alarm systems or illuminated streets. They had soft skin, dull teeth, and a complete inability to see without the sun. When the shadows lengthened, their greatest evolutionary advantage, their massive, energy-hungry brain, began to shut down to repair itself. The brain demands sleep. If a human stays awake for too long, their cognitive functions collapse, their body temperature drops, and they begin to hallucinate. So, they could not simply refuse to sleep. But sleeping meant ignoring the rustle in the dark. It meant ignoring the low growl carried on the wind. It meant hoping that the snap of a twig nearby was just a small animal and not a massive feline stalking the perimeter of the camp. This created a desperate biological problem. The human body requires deep, paralyzing unconsciousness to survive, but entering that state in the wild was nearly a death sentence. To stay alive, they had to invent a way to cheat death every single night. We are taught that early humans were fierce hunters who conquered the natural world. But the moment the sun went down, they became something else entirely. Modern people carry a very specific, comforting image of how our ancestors survived the night. We picture early humans retreating into deep caves as the sun set. We imagine them huddled together in a prehistoric bedroom, wrapped in thick animal hides, safely sealed away from the freezing wind and the roaming beasts. We tend to view the cave as the original fortress, a place made of solid rock, where a tired family could finally close their eyes and rest securely until the morning light. But that image is a modern projection, based entirely on our modern experience with locking doors and solid architecture. The ancient reality was far less forgiving, and the stone walls of a cave did not stop what was hunting them. The Pleistocene landscape was not empty when the sun went down. It was handed over to predators that were biologically engineered to operate in the total absence of light. Giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and prehistoric bears did not sleep at night. They hunted. These animals possessed olfactory systems capable of detecting human sweat, dried blood, and the scent of nursing infants from incredible distances. While a human stared blindly into the blackness, a night predator used a specialized reflective layer behind its retina called the tapetum lucidum. This membrane gathered and multiplied the faintest traces of starlight, turning an invisible landscape into a high-contrast map of moving prey. Because of this massive sensory mismatch, seeking shelter in a cave was often a terrible risk. A cave is not a secure vault. It is a natural funnel. While it successfully blocks the wind and traps body heat, it also creates a concentrated pocket of scent. The smell of human habitation, unwashed skin, rotting marrow bones, and biological waste would pool near the back of the cavern. As the night air cooled, that heavy, warm scent would slowly drift out of the cave mouth and roll down into the valleys. To a hungry pack of ancient hyenas sniffing the night breeze, a cave was not an intimidating fortress. It was a dead end holding a concentrated source of easy calories. If a predator decided to follow that scent trail inside, the very stone walls that provided warmth suddenly became a death trap. Natural caves rarely have secondary exits. If a massive feline stepped into the narrow entrance, the humans huddled at the back were completely cornered. In the pitch blackness of the cave interior, they would not even be able to see the attack coming. They would only be able to hear it. The sound of padded feet scraping against loose gravel, the smell of rancid breath, the low, vibrating growl echoing off the low stone ceiling. They would be slaughtered in total darkness. This physical vulnerability forced our ancestors into an impossible biological corner. Their large, complex brains demanded deep, paralyzing sleep to consolidate memories and repair tissue. But dropping into that state of total unconsciousness in an environment filled with apex predators was practically volunteering to die. They had to make a choice. And it is the central, brutal trade-off of ancient human survival. They had to choose between sleeping deeply and being dragged away into the dark, or sleeping in shallow, exhausting shifts. To survive the night, they had to intentionally fracture their own rest. They lived in a constant state of exhausting, paranoid vigilance, deliberately damaging their own nervous systems just to ensure that when the things in the dark came looking for them, at least one person would be awake to hear the footsteps. To understand the true weight of the ancient night, you have to strip away the artificial glow of the modern world. Imagine the sun dropping behind a jagged horizon of dry savanna. The temperature immediately plummets, pulling the heat from your bare shoulders. The wind shifts, carrying the heavy, damp smell of crushed grass, wet earth, and animal musk. But the most terrifying shift is physical. It happens inside your own eyes. Human vision is entirely dependent on light. As twilight fades, the photoreceptor cells in your retinas struggle to gather enough photons. Colors vanish first, leaving only shades of gray. Then, depth perception collapses. Finally, the edges of objects blur into shadows. Within an hour of sunset, the human eye is effectively useless. You are reduced to hearing and feeling your way through the world. This was the environment early humans had to survive every single night. The landscape did not go quiet just because they could no longer see it. In fact, the sensory deprivation made the ancient world intensely loud. The rustle of dry brush, the snap of a dead branch under heavy weight, the sudden, chilling silence of insects when a large predator moved through the tall grass nearby. Your ears would strain to identify the direction of the sound, but your eyes would offer no confirmation. To survive this daily blinding, early humans captured and maintained fire. We often think of the ancient hearth as a cozy gathering place for cooking meat and staying warm. While that is true, at night, fire served a much more desperate purpose. It was a localized weapon, a glowing perimeter of heat and chaotic movement that most animals instinctively avoided. But that protection came with a terrifying paradox. Fire kept the predators at a distance, but it also completely destroyed human night vision. If you have ever stood near a bright bonfire in the wilderness and tried to look into the woods, you know exactly how this feels. To process the bright, dancing light of the flames, your pupils must constrict. The moment they do, the ambient starlight and moonlight are blocked out. The fire creates a small, illuminated dome, but everything just 3 feet beyond the reach of the light turns into a solid, impenetrable wall of blackness. This means that when an early human sat beside the fire, they were bathed in light, making them perfectly visible to anything watching from the dark. But they could not see the watchers. The darkness beyond the ash was a sheer drop-off. They could hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a giant hyena just past the tree line. They could hear the scrape of claws on stone. If the flames flickered high enough, they might catch the sudden, floating reflection of 2 yellow eyes suspended in the black void. but they could not see the body attached to them. The fire did not eliminate the danger. It simply drew a line in the dirt and forced the danger to wait in the shadows. Now, put yourself back in that sleeping body. Your muscles are exhausted from a day of walking, hunting, and fleeing. Your blood temperature is dropping. Your brain is starved for the chemical reset of deep sleep. You are lying on the hard, cold dirt, smelling the wood smoke and the distant scent of predators. The fire is slowly burning down, shrinking the perimeter of your safety inch by inch. Closing your eyes in that environment was not rest. It was an act of blind trust. The human body presents a mathematical problem when it comes to survival. You cannot stay awake forever. When exhaustion sets in, cortisol floods the system, motor functions degrade, and eventually, the brain simply forces the body into unconsciousness, regardless of the danger. But if an entire group of early humans fell asleep at the exact same time, the fire would burn down to white ash, the scent of their sleeping bodies would drift freely into the darkness, and the predators would move in. Survival required a solution to this biological bottleneck. They had to figure out how to keep a continuous watch in the dark without dying of sleep deprivation. For a long time, researchers assumed that early humans simply assigned shifts, much like a modern military guard duty. They imagined a prehistoric leader telling one person to stay awake for the first 4 hours of the night and another to take the early morning watch. But recent evidence suggests the ancient reality was far more elegant and deeply embedded directly into our DNA. The proof of this adaptation does not come from cracked fossilized bones. It comes from the living biology of modern hunter-gatherers. When scientists attached wrist actigraphs, which are essentially advanced medical sleep trackers, to the Hadza people, a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania, they expected to see a synchronized sleep pattern. They assumed that when the sun went down, the tribe eventually went to sleep together, and when the sun rose, they woke up. But the data revealed something completely unexpected. Over a period of 20 days, monitoring a group of roughly 30 people sleeping in a natural environment, the researchers discovered that the entire group was collectively asleep for a grand total of only 18 minutes. At any given moment of the dark night, roughly 40% of the group was either awake or in a very light, easily broken state of rest. This constant, rolling rotation of wakefulness happened naturally, without alarms, without schedules, and without anyone forcing themselves to stay awake. Researchers call this the sentinel hypothesis. This is the moment we have to look at a biological reality that modern society often misunderstands. We all know people who naturally stay up late, and people who naturally wake up long before dawn. Today, we casually call them night owls and early birds. Modern corporate schedules often punish night owls, treating their inability to sleep early as a lack of discipline. But in the ancient world, this genetic variation in circadian rhythms was not a lifestyle choice. It was a highly evolved survival technology. Evolution deliberately staggered the sleep cycles of ancient humans. The night owls were genetically wired to feel alert and vigilant at 2 a.m. They were the ones who sat near the dying embers, listening to the wind, ready to throw a dry branch on the fire to keep the perimeter of light from shrinking. As their energy finally faded in the bitter hours before dawn, the early birds were genetically wired to open their eyes. They took over the watch, listening to the changing sounds of the predators retreating as the sky finally began to turn gray. This staggered sleep meant that a prehistoric camp was never fully unconscious. They did not have to suffer the physical deterioration of forced sleep deprivation night after night. Instead, their bodies adapted to ensure that someone was always naturally awake, alert, and listening to the dark. By fracturing their own collective rest and relying on the genetic lottery of chronotypes, they did something incredible. They built an invisible, living wall of human consciousness around the camp. Imagine sitting by the fire at 3 a.m. The flames have burned down to a dull, glowing orange heartbeat in the white ash. The cold air bites at your bare shoulders. Your eyes feel as though they are filled with coarse sand, burning with a desperate biological need to close, but you force them to stay open. Behind you, the rest of the tribe is asleep. You can hear their slow, rhythmic breathing. You can hear the soft sighs of sleeping children and the twitching limbs of hunters caught in deep dreams. In this exact moment, you are the only conscious barrier between your family and the pitch-black wilderness. You are the sentinel. But forcing the human body to stay awake in the middle of the night comes with a severe biological cost. The nervous system is deeply tied to the movement of the sun. When you stay awake past the point of total exhaustion, your brain begins to panic. It assumes there must be a life-threatening reason you are denying it the paralysis of sleep, so it pulls a chemical alarm. It floods your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate elevates in the quiet dark, your blood pressure spikes, your digestion slows down. Over years of living this way, this chronic, forced fragmentation of sleep damages the immune system and accelerates physical aging. The sentinel was literally burning their own bodily health to buy the tribe another sunrise. This was the brutal trade-off of the night watch. Survival required a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was paid directly by the nervous system. The person sitting by the ashes was not simply awake. They were existing in a state of sustained, agonizing hypervigilance. Sitting entirely alone in the dark does strange things to the human mind. The brain is an engine designed to recognize patterns, but in the thick black of the ancient savanna, it is completely starved of visual information. So, it violently overcompensates. It dials up the sensitivity of your hearing until the sound of a dry leaf scraping against a stone sounds like a snapping bone. It forces you to constantly scan the edge of the firelight, trying to decipher the shape of the moving shadows. You are not just keeping the embers alive. You are actively listening to the vast, terrifying silence, waiting for it to break. When the wind shifts, you smell the damp earth, and your mind races, wondering if you also catch the faint, rotting musk of a giant hyena. When the tall grass sways just beyond the light, your hand tightens around a heavy wooden branch, your knuckles turning pale. You cannot see the threat, but your physical body is entirely primed for sudden, explosive violence. This chronic paranoia was not a mental defect. It was a highly tuned, required adaptation. An early human who felt relaxed and secure in the dark was an early human who would quickly be removed from the gene pool. The people who survived, the ones who eventually passed their DNA down through the millennia to us, were the ones whose brains naturally leaned toward intense anxiety the moment the lights went out. They survived because they assumed the absolute worst about every single sound they heard. They learned through blood and loss that a glowing ember was completely useless if the person sitting next to it closed their eyes. Fire was a magnificent weapon, but it was not enough to keep them alive on its own. They needed something much sharper and much more exhausting to hold back the predators that hunted in the shadows. They needed the paranoid mind. When you stare into total darkness for hours at a time, your brain refuses to accept the lack of input. It cannot tolerate a vacuum. Deprived of the visual data it needs to navigate reality, the mind begins to manufacture its own. This is a known neurological phenomenon today, but for the ancient sentinel sitting alone by the dying fire, it was the terrifying birth of the supernatural. The human mind is a survival engine built entirely on pattern recognition. During the day, this ability allows you to spot the distinct shape of a ripe fruit hidden in a dense canopy of green leaves. But in the pitch black, fueled by heavy sleep deprivation and a bloodstream flooded with cortisol, this pattern recognition software becomes a chaotic, hyperactive machine. If you look into a cluster of dark bushes, your brain will suddenly connect the gaps and present you with the perfect outline of a crouching predator. You will swear you can see it breathing. Evolutionary biologists call this a false positive, and it is a vital biological safety feature. For an early human, believing a shadow is a leopard and throwing a rock at it costs a few calories. Believing a leopard is just a shadow costs you your life. Because of this brutal math, the ancient nervous system was aggressively wired to hallucinate threats where none existed. The auditory system, strained to its absolute limit, also began to warp the surrounding world. A dry branch scraping against a stone did not just sound like wood on rock. It sounded like teeth scraping on bone. The wind howling down a narrow ravine shifted and pitched until it sounded exactly like a human voice crying out in pain. Imagine sitting with your knees pulled to your chest, your heart pounding against your ribs, completely convinced that the invisible void around you is filled with breathing, watching entities. The sentinel was not just guarding against physical predators like the one that crushed the Swartkrans skull. They were battling the terrifying, uncontrollable creations of their own exhausted mind. They began to believe the darkness itself was alive. This nightly psychological torture fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. When the sky finally turned pale gray and the early birds woke up to relieve the watch, the exhausted sentinel did not keep the terror to themselves. They needed to explain why they were trembling. They needed to warn the others about the shape-shifting shadows, the massive beasts that vanished when the fire flared, and the voices hiding in the wind. They described invisible hunters that could not be killed with spears, and unseen forces that moved through the tall grass without bending the blades. These descriptions were not intentional fictions or primitive fairy tales. To a mind poisoned by sleep deprivation and fear, they were absolute reality. And as the sentinel spoke, the rest of the tribe listened, absorbing the warning. They gave these night terrors names. They created rules on how to avoid them. They began to develop a shared catalog of invisible dangers, a collective geography of the supernatural. This was the dawn of human imagination. What began as a desperate, solitary biological defense mechanism slowly transformed into shared belief. The sheer terror of sitting alone on the night watch forced human creativity into existence, and the things they imagined in the dark eventually became the stories that bonded the tribe together. For hundreds of thousands of years, the living wall of human consciousness was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The staggered sleep of the sentinel system worked, but the biological tax was incredibly steep. A species cannot thrive indefinitely on fractured rest, chronic stress, and a nervous system flooded with cortisol. To truly conquer the natural world, the human brain needed a way to enter deep, restorative sleep without the constant threat of being dragged away in the dark. They needed a substitute for the paranoid mind. They needed a way to externalize the night watch so the entire tribe could finally close their eyes at the exact same time. This desperate biological craving for unbroken unconsciousness became one of the greatest hidden driving forces behind human civilization. When we look back at the dawn of permanent settlements, we are usually taught that agriculture was the primary catalyst. We picture ancient humans realizing they could plant seeds, so they naturally stopped moving and built houses. But the reality of settling down was also deeply tied to the vulnerability of the human body. They were not just building homes to keep the rain off their heads, they were building static armor for their sleeping forms. Think about the physical reality of the first heavy door. It was not invented to provide privacy from neighbors. A thick slab of lashed timber or a massive, woven barrier of thorny brush wedged tightly into a stone frame served a very specific survival function. It was an artificial sentinel. A door does not need to stay awake, it does not suffer from sleep deprivation, and it does not hallucinate monsters in the shadows. It only needs to be heavy enough that a roaming predator cannot push it open without making a massive amount of noise. If a large feline or a pack of ancient scavengers tried to breach the entrance, the scraping wood and shifting rock would act as a crude acoustic alarm, giving the humans inside enough time to wake up and raise their spears. Early architecture was entirely defined by this lingering terror of the night. In ancient Neolithic settlements like Catalhoyuk, built over 9,000 years ago, the houses did not have ground floor doors. The exterior walls were solid, windowless blocks of thick mud brick. To enter their homes, people had to climb wooden ladders up to the roof and drop down through a narrow hatch. When the sun went down, they simply pulled the ladders up. They were deliberately engineering an artificial predator-proof environment, elevating themselves out of the reach of the things that hunted in the dark. When you build a solid wall, you are doing more than stacking mud and stone. You are building a physical barrier so your nervous system can finally stand down. This architectural shift changed human biology. By dragging heavy stones, lashing timber, and elevating their sleeping spaces, humans fundamentally altered their relationship with sleep. For the first time in our evolutionary history, an entire group of people could enter the paralyzing state of deep sleep safely. And at the same time, the cognitive consequences were massive. Deep, unbroken sleep clears metabolic waste from neural pathways and consolidates complex memories. When humans no longer had to burn their physical health on overnight vigilance, that massive reserve of energy was suddenly freed up for innovation. We look at brick walls, deadbolts, and illuminated streets as symbols of our modern dominance over nature. But at their core, these structures are simply advanced versions of a thorny branch pulled across a cave mouth. We built the entire modern world just so we could finally close our eyes without fear. Think about your own bedroom tonight. You will likely walk into a quiet room, flip a switch to flood the space with artificial light, and lock a solid door behind you. You will lie down on an elevated mattress, completely isolated from the wind, the cold, and the natural world. Modern people believe they have conquered the night. We think our sleep is entirely under our control, dictated by glowing alarms and comfortable routines. But your body has not forgotten where it came from. The ancient world is still awake inside your nervous system. Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning for absolutely no reason? Your eyes suddenly open in the dark. You are not hungry. You are not in pain. You just feel a sudden, inexplicable wave of alertness. Your heart might be beating a little faster than normal. You lie there in the quiet, straining to hear a sound in the house that you cannot quite identify. Modern doctors call this sleep maintenance insomnia. We treat it like a medical annoyance, a glitch in our stressful modern schedules. We take pills to suppress it and scroll on our phones until we pass out again. But it is not a glitch. When your eyes snap open in the dead of night, it is your ancient DNA doing exactly what it was engineered to do. You are experiencing the biological echo of the sentinel. For hundreds of thousands of years, waking up at that exact hour was not an inconvenience. It was a mandatory survival mechanism. Your nervous system is blindly following a genetic script written on the ancient savanna, briefly pulling you out of deep paralysis to check the perimeter. Your brain is firing a quiet alarm, asking if the fire has burned out, and listening to ensure the breathing of the tribe is undisturbed by heavy, approaching footsteps. Even the way we organize our homes is a subconscious reaction to this ancient terror. The first thing we do when we feel unsafe is check the locks. We feel an instinctual, creeping unease if a ground floor window is left open after midnight. We pull soft blankets tightly up to our necks, subconsciously shielding our most vulnerable arteries. We buy glowing nightlights for our children, telling them the soft illumination will keep the monsters away. We treat a child's fear of the dark as an irrational phase they will grow out of. But it is not irrational at all. A child terrified of the dark is simply a human being possessing a perfectly functioning survival instinct, one that remembers exactly what the darkness used to hide. We have paved the earth and pushed the massive predators to the very edges of extinction. We have built glowing cities of glass and steel that block out the stars. We have surrounded ourselves with so much security that we actually have to invent artificial fears just to feel a thrill. But comfort is a very thin, very recent illusion. If you want proof of how thin that illusion really is, think back to the Swartkrans cave in South Africa. Think of the cracked bone of the SK-54 fossil. Imagine the child it belonged to, closing their eyes for the last time, trusting the deep shadows of the cave just a little too much. The twin puncture marks left by the leopard are not just a fossil record of a prehistoric tragedy. They are a permanent, physical reminder of why human beings had to become the most paranoid, exhausted, hyper-vigilant creatures on the planet. We survived because we learned to fear the silence, and we built civilization because we were desperately tired of running. Tonight, when you turn off the lamp and let the darkness fill your room, listen to your own heartbeat. The ancient world did not disappear. It just went to sleep inside you.